All right, so I'm with Dr. Bill Lumsden, did I say that right?
Correct.
Who is the director of Distilling, Whiskey Creation, and Whiskey Stocks.
Yes.
And everybody in the U.S. mispronounces the name of your scotch, so would you pronounce it correctly for us?
Yeah, the correct way to pronounce it is Glenmorangie. So the emphasis on the orange, so like orange, the fruit.
Yeah, okay, good. And I learned so much. We had dinner the other night at Jezebel together, and I learned so much that I didn't know about the whiskeys. Well, one of the first things that everybody is always asking me about is, how do you know which way to spell whiskey? I mean, how do you spell whiskey?
Okay, there is actually no officially correct way. There's nothing in the law. It just seems to be the case that the Scotch whisky distillers and the Japanese whisky distillers and one or two others drop the E, whereas most of the rest of the world spell it with an E.
Okay.
And it always intrigues me that there is one brand in the States, I think it's Maker's Mark, they spell it without the E as well.
Really?
But there isn't officially a right or a wrong, they're both okay.
It's just tradition.
Yeah.
And what are you a doctor of?
I did a PhD in biochemistry.
Wow.
And once I finished that, my first job within the industry, which was with the old distillers company, Diageo as it is now, I was a research scientist with them for 4 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, one of the other things that I found fascinating was we were discussing was the fact that you're using all these different types of barrels.
Yeah.
That I don't think is really common for people in the whiskey business. So tell me a little bit about that.
Okay.
We're having some tea here, aren't we? It's tea time at the Four Seasons right now.
This is the first Earl Grey I've had since I left Scotland a couple of weeks ago.
Oh my!
Thanks very much, ma'am. Thank you. Earl Grey has always been one of my particular favourites. And you know, Earl Grey tea is infused with the flavour of bergamot orange, which of course is one of the key flavours you find in a lot of the Glenmorangie whiskies. But to go back, Wes, to your original comment, there's no question that Glenmorangie has been very pioneering in its use of different woods. And you know, what we started off, 15, 16, 17 years ago has now been much copied by many other players in the Scotch whisky industry.
Well, let's go back for a little history for people who don't know it. The tradition in Scotland has been to use barrels from Spain, right?
That's right. Historically, if you go right back, the first spirits produced in Scotland would not be matured at all. They would be clear, and they would almost certainly have been flavoured with berries or herbs or spices just to try and make them palatable.
Right.
But once the UK started trading a lot with France and Spain, they shipped in tens of thousands of barrels of wine, of wine and of sherry. So sherry casks became the original cask of choice. And in fact, the Glenmorangie company was the first company in Scotland to ship in some ex-bourbon barrels in 1947.
Whoa.
Now, when I say we were the first, difficult to prove that, but nobody else has come up and said that they did it before us. And with the end of Prohibition, with the change in the law and the end of the Second World War, it's highly likely that would have been the first. And nowadays, 90% of all Scotch whisky is filled into American oak ex-bourbon barrels.
Really?
Although most distillers will use their barrels many, many times.
It's interesting. A part of that may be the fact that the sherry business has dropped off so badly.
That of course, has a lot to do with it. But nowadays, the best quality sherry casks are actually made specifically for the Scotch whisky industry. They're called sherry shipping casks, and the oak wood is toasted on the inside. And frankly, it doesn't do a lot of good for the sherry wine, and the wines are invariably turned into food vinegars.
Oh, really?
Because they can't be bottled. So that's how we get round the fact, as you say, that industry has shrunk. But once they've been seasoned with sherry wine, particularly dry Oloroso, it soaks into the wood and it gives an interesting flavour to Scotch. However, within the Glenmorangie company, we believe that a full maturation on sherry doesn't always do the whisky too many favours, and it can completely dominate over other elements of it. So that's one of the reasons why all Glenmorangie spirit spends at least some of its time in American oak ex-bourbon casks.
Okay. And for people who may not know the answer to this, why don't you explain why the role of peat in your whiskey?
Yep. Okay. Peat is basically, I try and describe peat as being like coal, but several million years early, so it's not been compressed underneath the ground. And it's basically fossilized vegetation, fossilized ferns, heathers, mosses, all these plants which are very plentiful on the hillsides in Scotland. So Scotland and Ireland have a lot of peat mosses, and if you dig down into the ground, and you don't need to go that far down, typically going down only several feet into the ground, you'll come across this moist, compact stuff we call peat. And if you take that and then dry it, it is a very successful fuel. So peat was originally used by the households in Scotland to heat their homes, but when you burn it, it gives off a very characteristic smoke. We call it the peat reek, R-E-E-K. Reek means smell, it's an old Scottish word. And in the olden days when the distillers were malting the barley, there was no electricity, there was no gas, there was no things like that. So the only thing they had to dry the barley on was wood, coal or peat. So that's where it all came from. And again, nowadays the industry has changed a bit, and we offer a much more refined and elegant product. So the amount of peat used is still there, but it's very, like for Glenmorangie, it's very, very light. For our other brand, Ardbeg, it's very, very heavy. It's the most heavily peated whisky in Scotland. So that's one of the things that's originally set Scotch apart, was that it had this nice, rich, oily, smoky taste to it. But I made a Glenmorangie, a limited edition one 2 years ago. I've been working on it for a while, and I was trying to recreate the way I imagined Glenmorangie would have tasted 100 years or so ago. It was called Finalta, and I used some secret batches of medium peated Glenmorangie to be the heart of that recipe, because of course in these days, all of the whiskies in Scotland would have been much smokier than they are today. But that's basically what peat is.
So would Ardbeg be a good example of how they used to be?
Yeah, it's a very old-fashioned style of whiskey.
Yeah, and so as I tasted through yours, and we had, what did we have, 5 different Glenmorangies?
Yeah.
There was a wide range of flavors, and really, I think almost something for everyone. But for somebody who is new to the whiskey of Scotland, where should they start?
I would say that if you're not used to drinking whiskey, then choose something that's a bit more accessible. And of course, Glenmorangie Original is a perfect introductory whiskey for people. But it was interesting that one of the ladies I met at Whiskies of the World, a lady called Susan, who interviewed me by telephone a week ago for her radio station, the first whiskey she tried that evening, and she wasn't a whiskey drinker, was Lafroig 18-year-old, and I said,
pretty strong.
and she said she found it really quite off-putting.
Yeah.
So it was a relief for her to come to the Glenmorangie stand and try something a bit more accessible.
Yeah.
But, if you're starting off, go into a good bar or a good liquor store where the staff are knowledgeable, and they'll help guide you through it and suggest something.
Yeah, always a good
to try.
point.
And that's why we put such a focus on training, staff training for some of these outlets.
Yeah. So you go. Is it time to push?
Yeah. It should be okay now.
So, and then what's the next step up? We had of those whiskeys that we had. What would be the next step up for somebody who's decided they really like your style of your standard whiskey, but they want to move up and try something even a little better? What's the next step up?
The next step would be to try maybe the La Santa or the Quinta Ruban, which is essentially the original 10 years in bourbon cask, and then a final 2 years finishing its maturation or having an extra maturation in sherry cask for La Santa, port cask for Quinta Ruban, or Sauterne cask for Nectar d'Or. So that's moving on up through the scale, and then once they really get into it, really realise that they like the brand and want to spend a bit more money, you could maybe move on to the 18-year-old or maybe even our 25.
You know, the one, as we were tasting through, the one that I thought was the most accessible because the mouthfeel on it was really nice and the aromas were great, was Little Santa. That just seemed to me like something anybody could drink happily.
Because of the sweetness in it from the sherry cask, it does have quite an accessible taste.
Yeah. But they were all good. And then we had an opportunity to taste a once-in-a-lifetime whiskey from you guys. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Glenmorangie Pride was something I set out to do back in the late 1990s when I first moved into the predecessor of my current role. I made a wish list of lots of different cask types that I wanted to get hold of, and the top two in my list were barrels from Domaine de la Romanie Conti in Burgundy and Chateau d'Yquem in Sauternes. So I was setting my sights.
Just for people who don't know, those are extraordinarily expensive wines. Yes.
Yeah, Romani Conti is the most expensive wine in the world.
Right.
And Yquem is the absolute pinnacle of the Sauternes appellation. So I set my sights pretty high, and I have to be honest, Wes, and say I didn't really think I'd get them, but actually within 6 months, a contact I had in France who, like myself, was a big rugby fan and an ex-rugby player, he managed to get me barrels from both these places. So I laid down some pretty special Glenmorangies in them, and the one we tried, I chose 18-year-old Glenmorangie, took it out the bourbon barrels and transferred it, re-racked it, is the industry word, into that small number of Chateau d'Yquem casks, and I just left it to finish or extra mature, and I kept trying to see how far I could push the boundaries, and eventually after 10 years in these casks I decided, right, that was quite enough. There was a danger that there was going to be too much wood coming through, too much tannin, and so I bottled it 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, and that was the product, Glenmorangie 1981 Pride, that we tried.
And there's didn't you say there's like 1 or 2 bottles left in the United States somewhere?
There may be more than that in the States. There was 2 left in Texas, although my updated information I got this morning is that they are now both sold.
Oh, well.
There was only 1,000 worldwide.
Yeah. And how much was that again?
It was about $3,800 retail.
Yeah, it's a good bottle of whiskey.
But the good news is that for people who are keen to try that style of whiskey, I have a product, the Nectar d'Or, at 12 years old, which is 10 years in bourbon and 2 years in Sauternes cask, and that's obviously a much more accessible price point.
How much is that?
James, the Nectar d'Or would retail at what?
Probably around $70.
Right, about $70 a bottle.
Okay. Yeah. Still a lot of money, but beautiful whiskeys. So as we are sitting here drinking our Earl Grey teas, you said that there was a flavor in them that reminded you of your whiskey. I want to just go into that a little bit.
Yep, it's the flavour of bergamot orange, which is a very, very aromatic type of orange, and the tea leaves are infused with that, and it gives a nice fruity tang to it. And bergamot orange is one of the flavours that you will readily find in Glenmorangie Original. Is a lot of fruity and floral flavours. You know, you'll get hints of apple, of pear, of peach, nectarine, lemon, and of course the bergamot orange. And you know, sometimes when I say to people that I can pick up lemon, they say, "Lemon and whiskey? Are you nuts?" But actually, I've tracked it right down to the actual compounds that are causing it, and it's compounds called limonene and linalool. They're produced by the yeast during fermentation. And guess where else in nature you find lots of limonene?
I can't guess. Lemons.
Yeah, lemons. Absolutely. Freshly squeezed lemon juice.
Yeah.
Right?
Boy, I tell you, it's spoken like a doctor. That's amazing. So the last question I have for you is for people who want to learn about whiskey but are just a little bit afraid of drinking it neat.
Yeah.
What do you recommend?
Yep, okay, I mean, whiskey is not something to be scared of, it's something to treat with respect. And at full strength, it can sometimes be full on, particularly if it's a cask strength whiskey, where the alcohol could be as high as 60%.
Right.
But even if you're drinking normal strength, 43%, I would say, if you just add a splash of water to it, obviously it's best if you use a good quality mineral water, not one with too many salts in it. And add a splash
or bleach
of
like we have here in Austin.
You don't want to be doing that. But if you add that to it, and if you've got a measure of, say, 3 fingers worth of whiskey in the glass, just one of water is enough, and it tones down the alcohol, it softens it in the palate, but it opens up the bouquet of the whiskey and brings more flavour. So that's why we call it releasing the serpent in the whiskey industry. So that's the way to do it. The other thing is, it's not a crime to put ice in your whiskey.
I saw you do that at dinner, yeah.
It'll give you a different perspective on the flavour, and it'll accentuate the deeper basal flavours, particularly some of the nice oaky flavours. But 10-20 years or so ago in Scotland, if you were caught putting anything in your whiskey other than more whiskey, it was very much frowned upon. Nowadays we're a bit more relaxed about it.
That's funny. I was the way I learned to put water in my whiskey was in Edinburgh at a dinner, and was asking the sommelier about his wine list. He knew nothing about his wine list.
Right.
And I said,
that's disappointing.
Yeah. I said, well, how come? He said, well, I just moved here. And I said, oh, what were you doing before? I was just making conversation, like, how's the weather outside? He said, oh, I was the whiskey master at Gleneagles. I went, oh,
right.
I'd like to learn something from you. Yeah. So that was the first person that told me to put water in my...
Which hotel was that, Wes? Can you remember?
No, I can't.
The Caledonian, the Balmoral?
That sounds right.
Caledonian,
yeah.
Because it used to be part of the same group that owned Gleneagles. It's not anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a nice hotel.
Yeah, it was, yeah. So, well, I can't think of any other questions unless there's something you think that people should know of that I haven't asked you yet.
Yeah, the one thing I would say for people watching this, that there is definitely a single malt Scotch whisky out there for you. There's one to suit every palate.
Yeah.
So give it a go.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I did learn from the dinner with you is I think that your standard brand Glenmorangie, which is how much in the stores?
It's about $40 a bottle for the original.
That's to me, that's a great place to start.
Yeah, it is.
It's an easy drinking whiskey. It's not. I mean, I have to admit to a certain love of Islay Scotches myself, but those are very tough to start with. They're very tough to start with.
I mean, I can drink any whiskey in our range. I've gone full circle, and I drink more of the original than anything else. I just think it's so beautiful and clean and elegant.
Yeah. Well, good job. Well, thank you so much for coming to Austin, and hope you get back for our next F1 race.
Oh, I hope so. Yes. Nice to meet you. Thank you. Yes.